Hello and welcome to MySecurity TV and our Tech and Sec Weekly. My name's Chris Covage, I'm the editor with MySecurity Media, and this is our Friday morning episode. We're going to cross to Melbourne, I hope, and with Monash University and Professor Jude McCulloch, who is with the Faculty of Arts in Criminology. And we're going to look at the Chauvin trial and the outcomes and impacts on policing. And this is obviously to do with the murder of George Floyd in the US, but it has obviously had ramifications around the world. So quite contrasting subjects this morning, but both very interesting. Now, complete change of tack, and we're going to be joined by Jude McCulloch, the Emeritus Professor in Criminology with the Faculty of Arts with Monash University. Jude, pleasure to have you on.
Pleasure to be here, Chris.
Great, good audio check too. We haven't done a pre-interview discussion, so we're going to get straight into it.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and I suppose, what's your initial take on the whole circumstance? And maybe a little bit more, maybe introduce yourself to the audience, I think, first in terms of being a criminologist, and I had a little bit of research on you, so you quite focus on policing as well. Yeah, what's your initial take and background into this this particular issue?
Yes, as you said, I'm a criminologist, and prior to about 20 years in academia, I worked as a community lawyer. And a focus of my work when I worked in community legal centres was on police brutality and violence, and ultimately the use of lethal force by police. Some people might remember that in the mid-1990s, early to mid-1990s, there was a spate of fatal shootings by Victoria Police, and I was involved with a campaign that was run by Flemington Kensington Legal Service and the Uniting Church to look into the circumstances of those shootings. There was a feeling that Victoria Police were living by the culture of the gun and that people were being unnecessarily shot. That actually led to the initial academic career that I had. I looked at the circumstances behind police use of lethal force and found there was a trend towards militarisation, greater integration of the police and military, their philosophy, tactics and training, and weapons and hardware into policing, and that was part of the explanation. So that's what's kept me interested
busy
in policing, and particularly the use of brute force, brutality, excessive force, however you want to call it, police fatal shootings and lethal killings or killings by police.
With just my background, I was policing 1990 to 2005 in Western Australia, and yeah, I remember those days very well. Particularly, even nationally, policing were like, "What's going on in Victoria?" And I suppose that's the difference now. So leaving 2005 and looking at it in 2020 and what's happening in the US, do you think obviously it's focused on culture? I mean, where do you think the link is? Maybe we'll start with that in terms of a police organisation, how they treat and deal and interact with the community, and then how they interact with themselves. How linked do you think this is to culture and leadership versus then the accoutrements that they have in terms of tasers and other force options that they have? What are your thoughts about, I know it's a bigger picture there, but where do you think the key aspect that we would focus on if we want to make a change in the way that the police deal with the community and violence?
I think that's a really good question. And thinking about militarisation of police can be seen most obviously when they use military type hardware in their operations, and it can be from tanks to automatic weapons, and when they use extremely high levels of force, tactics that are focused on overwhelming force rather than minimum force. But really militarisation, that's the visible part of militarisation. We often see that, for example, when police are dealing with protesters, particularly the research says progressive protesters and protests involving a lot of minority community people. But the real heart of militarisation is a philosophy, and that philosophy is that you don't approach people as suspects who might have committed a crime but are nevertheless citizens entitled to due process, but you approach people, and particularly people from minority communities, as enemies within, who you use or are entitled to use overwhelming force against with impunity. And I think that that is actually the heart of it. So you talk about culture. So in America, there's this saying, the thin blue line. It came from a film, I think, originally, but is something that's quite popularised, this idea that there's this thin line of police between chaos and protection or safety. But that phrase has increasingly become embroiled with notions of white supremacy. And that is because that line is most deeply etched in race. So if you're black or brown, African American, or a coloured person, or a person of colour in America, you're far more likely to be dealt with as an individual and as communities as the enemy within. And you see that reflected statistically, for example, and this is partly why the phrase Black Lives Matter has taken off, exploded since 2013, is African Americans are 13% of the population, but they're 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police. And really differential uses of force and lethal force by police officers. And of course, this is behind the global phenomena of Derek Chauvin, who killed African-American man George Floyd by kneeling on his neck for nearly 10 minutes in public, in broad daylight. And as President Joe Biden said, we're not really talking about just one act of individual brutality, violence and murder by a police officer. We're looking at systemic racism in policing, and that's why it's an issue in the US. But why it's a global issue is because formerly enslaved people, First Nations people in settler countries like Australia, they recognise the symbology and the reality of this that has taken place through the generations.
I think it would be nice to see if it was just in the US, but as you just said, this is around the world, and really here in our own backyard, as you point out, here in Australia. And you know, deaths in custody is being highlighted again now, following the Royal Commission 20 years ago, and we're still seeing deaths in custody. That's often not even involving violence. They're just in the system already. So this goes back. Do you have an answer? I suppose maybe that's a good question. Because it's easy to make the observations, and everyone knows, you know, everyone can see it. Whether they recognise or whether they want to acknowledge it is a different thing. But it's visibly there across Australia in particular, but obviously in the US. But nothing changes, and it's like, is it because there is no answer, that this is going to be a slow burn, that we have to just make those long, difficult choices for long-term generational change? Or, and I touched on it in my introduction, we did an interview with, on climate change with former defence leaders last week, and they're saying there's just a lack of leadership, a lack of government leadership. Do you think there's a divide there between the states have to have that responsibility for policing, and then they're all doing their own thing? You have a Federal Royal Commission that can't implement it because the states won't do it, or the states won't change. Do you have an answer? Where do you think? I mean, I did focus on cultural, but then you brought up the militarisation of police. That changes the culture. How can you change the culture to non-violence when you're giving them semi-automatic weapons and armoury, and then telling them to go out in the street? You can't say go out and be gentle with a semi-automatic rifle. Yeah. Your
I think
thoughts?
you make a lot of good points, and starting with the kind of connection between where we are now in Australia and events in the US. After George Floyd was killed in May 2020, murdered in broad daylight for everyone to see because there was a video, there were Black Lives Matter protests all around the world, including Australia. There were tens of thousands of people marched, and some had placards that said, "Different soil, same story." So that same story is police racism, systemic. And that racism doesn't come out of nowhere. It reflects the broader culture, but it also reinforces the broader culture, because when Indigenous or First Nations or Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people are over-policed, they're reproduced as criminals in the public imagination. So, and you talked about 30 years since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody made more than 300 recommendations. They were looking at 99 deaths in custody when they brought out their report in 1991. Since then, there's been nearly 500 deaths in custody. And this is, as you said, some of them are deaths in that they weren't murdered. But I think we need to say killings / deaths, because there was violence in some of those incidents, there's no doubt. And in a system where police and corrections officers were held accountable, there would be people charged in relation to those events. What we've got to understand about George Floyd and the Chauvin trial and the guilty verdict, found guilty on 3 counts. So he committed a murder, we all saw that, and he was found guilty of murder. But impunity is the general rule, and a lot of people talk about how the Chauvin verdict of guilty was like a unicorn event. So many things had to come together to get that guilty verdict. The most perhaps compelling part of it is there were 8 witnesses, and there was that videotape that everyone saw. Got to remember, when people might not know this, but after George Floyd was murdered, the police department in Minneapolis put out a media release saying that a man had a medical event while being taken into custody. The police called for medical assistance, but unfortunately he died. So unless that videotape existed, we would never say that George Floyd was murdered. We wouldn't even say he was killed. We would say he died. So
well, it even comes down to those tactics of why he was laying on his neck. You're trained, police are trained, and this is where it touches into the security sector as well, of asphyxiation and just laying someone down. We were trained not to do that and to be aware that that is happening. So there was a degree of intent that you saw in that video, and even the words from George Floyd in that regards, he can't breathe. But we still see it even in the security sector, the headlocks and those types of manoeuvres that are made, and that's how people really get hurt, or the head injuries from that as well. You choke someone out and then let them drop, and their head hits the ground and they suffer an aneurysm. So there's a range of different techniques that police security need to be aware of and should be aware of, and there is no real excuse other than in a situation of defence, where you're defending yourself in a live situation. But there was nowhere near that for that.
No, Chris, I think you touch on something important there. Training is often put up as the answer to these things, but when you see a police officer who intentionally does that, training's not going to fix that. What you see is a lack of humanity and a criminal act. You can't be trained out of lacking humanity, in my view. So, and also, it's not just a matter of training, because these tactics are so differentially applied depending on what race you are. There's no doubt about that in my mind. You asked before, what's the solution? We can see that there is a problem, and many people would agree to that. Well, in the US, they've got the George Floyd Justice in Policing Bill or Act before their parliament, and that would ban chokeholds, would ban no-knock raids, which we call forced entry raids here, put restrictions on militarisation, and importantly, end what's called qualified immunity, where individuals can't sue the police. And better data collection around issues to do with police misconduct and violence. There is no one solution. And you talked about the state system here and the federal system, and if that was an impediment to change. I think what's the real impediment to change is not acknowledging there's a problem to begin with, not listening to Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people, First Nations people, secondly, and not acting. So 30 years since the Royal Commission made its more than 300 recommendations, it took Victoria something like 29 years to implement decriminalising public drunkenness. And some of the Aboriginal deaths in custody or killings would have been prevented had that been implemented earlier. In the US, Joe Biden, the president, he met with the family of George Floyd and spoke to them before and after the verdict. In Australia, Aboriginal families of men who've died in custody, men and women who've died in custody, are begging and have been asking to meet with the Prime Minister for a long time. There's a petition going round about that, and it has been for some time. He won't meet with them. And
it does sound a lot. I come back to the lack of leadership, though.
Yes, and Joe Biden has talked about systemic racism in policing, what that does and what it means for people of colour and African Americans, how they live in fear and how it's a stain on the country. He also talked about that in his first address to Congress, which I think was yesterday or the day before. In the face of the Black Lives Matter protest in Australia, our Prime Minister said, there's no problem here, it's a fair country. He denied the history of slavery. There's also a history of slavery here. Not the same as in the US, but there is a history of slavery and, of course, massacres. So you've got to acknowledge that problem. There also needs to be leadership in policing. When the police chief in New South Wales says, when a police officer's caught on smart camera phone, pushing, throwing, slamming a 16-year-old Indigenous boy into the pavement, says, well, the police officer was having a bad day, then we know we've got a problem in leadership in this country. And one of the things that happened in the George Floyd trial, or the Derek Chauvin trial, of course George Floyd wasn't on trial, was fellow police officers were witnesses against Derek Chauvin. That's very unusual. And they have a black chief police officer who gave evidence, who in his time in policing in Minneapolis had been highly critical of the racism in policing. So that's the type of leadership and the sort of change to culture that we need here. And we need the implementation 30 years on of those Royal Commission recommendations in every single state.
Yeah, look, I would definitely advocate for that. For the fact that it hasn't happened is a red flag, I think, to everybody. There's a couple of things here. One is I wanted to touch on body-worn cameras and the importance of those. And then the other one was, you know, the community approach. This isn't just a policing issue. Policing, as you said, reflects a broader societal issue. There's something, I suppose, looking back in my days of, it does become an us and them. When you're dealing with local community, they hate the police. You've got to go in there and solve a whole bunch of non-policing issues. It might be, you know, mental health. There's other sort of issues going on in that community that you have to deal with because policing is that kind of service. It's on the front line. But it's housing, it's education. You know, it's a societal approach from the bottom up as well. You know, and I was born in the Pilbara, and you know, you look at a town like Newman, and they're at times in crisis, and it's not a policing issue. This is a societal community issue, and it's again long term. This is a 200, 300-year history of change. So again, it's one of those things of, and I know from a policing perspective to be like, well, hang on, you know, we're just doing our best, we're just doing our job, and it's tough out there, and that's why they do band together, because you do have a sense of us and them. Policing can also deal with, you get overexposed to the negative side of a community. You know, you're not dealing with the nice people and the good people because you don't have to, but you end up having to just deal. And so that change over time can occur. Was one of the reasons I got out, because I just did not want to go back onto the front line once I became a detective. And you kind of, you know, I was at homicide, so you kind of, that's almost a good part of the job. It's being on the front line and on the street is not a good place to be, certainly not for long periods of time. So there's that aspect, the operational challenges. Just being a police officer on the street is a real challenge, and whether they get that support. And then the link to that back to broader issues of society and what the government does. There's no question there. It's more my observation and the importance of broader community leadership as well, not just on policing.
No, I agree with you. You started off with the issue of body-worn cameras, and I think that's important. What people are saying, have said in the case of George Floyd and the trial of Derek Chauvin, is that it wasn't justice. It was a step towards justice, but it was a degree of accountability, because police usually act with impunity when they use excessive force or lethal force, particularly against minority communities and particularly against black and coloured people. So the body-worn cameras potentially could be something that promised accountability. But the problem with them, the body-worn cameras, is the police control the footage often. Often they won't release it, and there's been some court cases recently in Australia, and they're not obliged to, for example, in a civil action, release the body-worn camera footage. The thing that made the difference, and is making the difference, and has been making the difference since the 1990s, is the change in technology and the availability of smartphones. So apart from
general CCTV as well in the streets.
Exactly. But particularly smartphone footage, the police and authorities do not have control over the release of that. If that very brave, at the time, 17-year-old girl hadn't taken that 10-minute footage of the incident, the murder of George Floyd, there never would have been a trial, in my view. It would have been seen as a medical incident. So that's the difference between people having control of the technology and the police having the control of the technology. You talked about policing not being the answer and policing being a hard job, particularly for frontline police. I absolutely agree. And with law and order politics, with the politics of fear, with the dog whistling around racism, the idea that black Australians and Americans are criminal because they're criminalised often. There has been an enormous pouring of resources into policing, and there's been the hollowing out or the undermining of a whole lot of other services that would be more appropriate, like mental health services, like health services. So I guess there's two aspects to this. There's alternatives to policing, so ensuring that there's proper health services, ensuring that people get access to a good education and an income that they can live on, meaningful employment, purpose in life,
no alcohol,
rehabilitation, all those things. And apart from alternatives to policing, which is sort of covered quite starkly and most sharply with the slogan defund the police and reinvest the money elsewhere, there's also alternative modes of policing. So policing can be on a spectrum, it can be militarised, or it can be really community-based. And we know in Australia and from the US and places that these things have been implemented, justice reinvestment, as it's sometimes called, putting money that might have gone into policing into other services works, and also alternative modes of policing, for example, in Australian Indigenous communities having self-determination in the way things are policed, because First Nations people won't say there's no problems in their community. They won't say they don't need support and help, including from the police. But what they want is a response that's culturally sensitive and that's not counterproductive. So I know.
Yeah, I think that, well, there's always two. I mean, I've been on the record sort of supporting sort of semi-automatics at the airport in terms of the patrolling at an airport, in terms of critical infrastructure, the signal that sends to potential criminals in that environment. And then in contrast to, say, mentioned, say, Newman, or you got it in North Queensland and throughout the Kimberley region, often it's alcohol-related violence, antisocial behaviour. That's a different model. And I think, do you think they're being creative and sort of risk-averse to new models? I mean, they're trying, all I can see at the moment is the welfare card or something like that, but there's no other real community models that I see at a local level that the community's trying to make changes or implement new models that, you know, might not work, but at least they're trying. Are you seeing anything like that in terms of the research as well of what might work? Is it just that local community taking that leadership role and almost doing away with maybe a traditional criminal justice system that might be operating in the state, but just saying, look, we want our own legal system and we need to sort of take it out of a criminal justice system? What's your thoughts there?
Well, I believe that there are successful programs, and Burke is often pointed to in New South Wales as an example of a successful Indigenous-led, you know, alternative modes of policing and alternatives to policing. And I think it's important to listen to Indigenous people and give self-determination. That's where the solutions will come from. And you'd have to say we're not doing very well at the moment. So it's time to, and people say where there are good programs, they tend to be pilots, and then the funding's not continuous. So I think, and look, I think what people say is, look, we know what works. It just needs to be funded. And we need to work with local communities. We know what doesn't work, and we're doing that.
Yeah, I think, look, I do agree with that. Is we know what doesn't work, but we keep doing it expecting different results, which is, as they say, a sign of madness. But it is definitely what we do. And I know the good intentions are there often, even at a political level, where they would love to make those changes, or they do try. I do also know from a policing perspective, they wish they didn't. If there was an alternative, or they were told you don't have to do that anymore, and we've got an alternative, I'm sure most police would go, great, do it, because, you know, operational police don't have that decision to make. And I think the other thing is at the commissioner level versus to the police ministers, and then through to the justice system, that's where the change needs to make, because the police commissioner is legislated to do that work. He doesn't have the choice. So it comes back to the police minister and the government of the day to make those changes, and there's no point doing it out of pocket. You've got to do it nationally. Yeah,
the chief commissioners, I'll say she, because there are some she chief commissioners.
Mm-hmm.
In any hierarchical organisation, the police is highly hierarchical. As you say, leadership is so important in terms of change, whether it be cultural or whether it be structural. So we need political leadership. We need leadership in policing. And there has been examples of good leadership.
Yeah. Look, as we said, it happens in pockets, and I think that's the problem. So this session was really focused on the outcomes of the Chauvin trial and the impacts on policing. As Jude's mentioned, there's been sort of legislative change in the US in terms of police tactics and things like chokeholds and those types of things. And are you hearing noise here in Australia, Jude, in terms of making those similar changes here, or do you think over time may well occur?
Well, I think what needs to happen here is, at bottom line, the Royal Commission's recommendations need to be implemented in full. There's groups of Indigenous organisations working on Close the Justice Gap, and their voice needs to be heard.
Okay, and the other one I would suggest is body-worn cameras, even though there's problems around those, but I think the broader they are, the key word's accountability. You know, from a policing perspective, if you're accountable, that'll always be in your back of your mind. And I'm kind of glad there weren't as many cameras around in my day as well. It's like, yeah, times have changed, and not all good, or not all for the good, unfortunately, as well. So look, Jude McCulloch, the Emeritus Professor of Criminology, Faculty of Arts, Monash University, absolute pleasure. And I think we'll monitor this over the time, Jude. It's one of those things of, I'm a bit of a, I call myself an optimistic pessimist. So my view is things won't change, and we could be here in another 20, 30 years and no doubt probably talking about the same thing. But I hope I'm wrong, but I don't have a lot of faith, to be honest, in the way things work.
Well, the Chauvin verdict was historic, was emotional, and it was said to be a beacon of hope. So I'd like to be hopeful without suggesting there isn't a lot of change that's still necessary, both here and in the US. But thank you for your time, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely, Jude. And I'll let you go. Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao. Okay, I'll let you go. Patch backstage. And thank you to Jude, and thank you to the audience there and some of the comments. And thank you to Katie as well. Look, it's not the best topic, but it's certainly an interesting one and broad-ranging in terms of impacts and opportunities there for here in Australia, and also obviously in the US, and we mentioned the UK also. As I do, I'll close off with the report of the day, and the I think it's Robert Half. Yeah, Robert Half, their salary guide 2021 just came out, and really showing now 79% of Australian leaders say hybrid workforces are comprised of employees working remotely in an office, and now a permanent part of the employment landscape. We kind of knew that already, but it's getting locked down in terms of these reports and studies. Remuneration trends. Employees still plan to award salary increases. This is probably a good thing. That's 31% yes for all employees in terms of, do you plan to increase salaries for existing employees in 2021? The average salary increase company leaders plan to give in 2021 is 6%. So that's not too bad. And yes, but only for top performers is 38%. So you've got at least nearly 70% there in terms of a raise for all employees or for top performers. And no, was it 22% were no, and then 9%. So about 30% is either a no or not sure. So if you're working for one of those employers, you're not getting a raise. And in terms of in-demand technical skills, and this is available obviously on the My Security Marketplace, so you can check this out for a download. But the in-demand, the top one there is software and web development, and then business intelligence and reporting, and then in-demand soft skills, logical problem solving and communication skills, and innovative thinking. New Zealand, top 5 permanent roles, software developer, tester and product manager, and top 5 contract roles, software developer, tester and systems engineer. And then in Australia, we've got help desk support officer is the top 5, then systems and security engineers, and then the top 5 contract roles, help desk support officers. I think it's probably because they're bringing all the help desk back to Australia for a bit of a sovereignty play, and then the systems engineer and software developers. So if you are a software developer, you are in hot demand according to the Robert Half Salary Guide 2021. You should probably be asking for a pay rise. Please check out the Cyber Risk Leaders magazine and our Cyber War series. And now that's it from us for a couple of weeks. I'm going to take a few weeks break. We might do the odd interview, and we do have some other podcasts and MySec TV interviews coming through, but they won't be live. So in terms of the live streaming, I may stream from Perth. I'm off to WA for a good couple of weeks, and we'll see how we go. But certainly next week we're going to take a break. We'll be back to live streaming in late May. So thank you very much for joining us on our Tech and Sec Weekly Friday morning episode. and enjoy your Friday and your weekend.